Thank you, Patricia. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Nadine Newville. I am currently the acting director in the Office on Violence Against Women. My normal day job, if you will, is as the Deputy Director for Grant Development and Management. I am joined today by Sunita Joshi, who is our conference administrator. If you submitted a conference to OVW, it has gone through Sunita's hands at some point. And I'm also joined by Aisha Gaston, who is our program analyst for the program division, and she has also participated in the conference cost approval process. And she is actually the person who sends you the email letting you know that your conference has been approved or denied. Thankfully, most of our conferences are approved. So this is actually a two-part webinar, if you will. We know that conference costs are not the most exciting thing that everybody does in their normal day-to-day, well, for most people. And we've had a webinar before a couple years ago, and we just could not cover everything in one session. Webinars are hard as it is, you know, the distance, but we decided that the best way to handle this webinar would be to break it into two pieces, so hopefully everybody who's participating has had an opportunity to listen to the oh-so-exciting Part A webinar, which covered the process and the forms. And now we're here to answer any follow-up questions you might have, things that maybe you need to get into some more nitty-gritty detail about. We also have some things that we feel we could add some more detail to if people are interested. So please, you know, don't hesitate. Type in your questions. This is really a conversation for your benefit, and we'd love to get started. I will toss up some of the things that we have been talking about here that we'd like people to focus a little bit more on or be careful about. One of them is make sure that you are using your proper procurement procedures in selecting hotels. We know that we all as individual travelers develop relationships with hotel groups where maybe you are a Marriott member. I know my father has had a million, almost I think 2 million Marriott points at one time, which carried us around the world as a family. And I am a member of every single hotel club possible. However, that cannot be a guiding determinant in hotel selection when you're working with the federal government. You need to go through a bid process that ensures that the federal government is getting the best possible value, with some balance, obviously, because the best value may not suit the purposes of our meeting in terms of meeting space. And so it won't make a lot of sense maybe to get a hotel that doesn't have the appropriate breakout rooms or can't provide your necessary audio-visual equipment. But we also know that many of your colleagues have gone through some serious effort to identify hotels that will provide the federal per diem and still meet their other needs. And they may not be the swankiest places, and some of them are a little more out of the way than others, but they take into consideration things like accessibility for all participants and still meeting the federal per diem. So we can connect you with people who've had success, and also we're willing to work with you if you just are not having success, but we did want to remind you. So did we hear anybody trying to chime in with a question? Otherwise, I'm going to think that the webinar covered everything. Maybe. And you're all just here because you're curious. What more will I say? I will not say that we're getting rid of conference costs. Sorry. Will 10 people drop off now?
So Kat has a few questions.
Okay. So Kat, thank you. Kat, you know, we call you a heavy hitter in the conference land, right? It means that you hold a lot of events, and I have to say you guys do a particularly good job on your forms. You're quite well versed in the process. Kat is one of those people I would say reach out to if you have questions. So go ahead. Kat's questions are?
Typing.
You're typing. Okay. Well, I can also say that another two other experienced people on the phone, Marta Holbrook with NCJFCJ and Yoko, they also submit a lot of forms and have a lot of experience with the process and are quite detailed in their submission. And additional, I don't see Nushin on today, but Nushin is another from Practice International.
Okay, so Kat says that she saw on the webinar, it said that we only need proof of the venue search if we're paying for room rentals. Did she hear that correctly?
You did hear that correctly. If the room is free, if your meeting space is free, you do not need proof of other, you don't have to put other venues on the form. And also if you're using federal space, you don't have to.
Free.
If it's free, right. So it's all about free.
Okay. Wow, this is super helpful to know.
Oh, good. But I can't really see well from the distance from the phone to the screen here. So Aisha is kindly reading the questions for us. Yeah, the screen is rather small considering. So something else that someone had asked us prior is a question regarding the agenda. And, so we do ask that you include your agenda with your submission. The agenda can be in draft form. However, there has to be enough information for us to ascertain that the length of the event that you need to have is really fits the agenda. You don't have to have every last detail ironed out. You don't have to necessarily know all of the speakers that you're going to have, but you need to have enough of a curriculum agenda developed that we can make a determination that this is an appropriate meeting to be holding with your cooperative agreement, and it's necessary, travel is necessary for it, and that it meets the, that the length of the meeting is appropriate.
Okay, so Jenna had a question, and this is about exceeding the AV cap. She attended the Vera's Creating Accessible Training event, and one of the presenters mentioned that you can justify exceeding the AV threshold by saying that the conference needs X number of mics, etc., in order to fully be accessible.
If you're going to exceed the AV cap for that reason, you need to make sure, so there's a two-part answer. Let me back up 1 second. Yes, that is correct, what Vera guided you on. And you need to make sure that you submit your form at least 120 days before you need to know whether the event is approved or denied. Because if you exceed the cap, we will have to send it up to the Assistant Attorney General for administration. But they have been very fast and accepting of this explanation that it is needed for, that you need additional microphones or what have you for accessibility reasons. I would say if, in particular, if you really need to exceed AV because of a deaf participant or a participant who's hard of hearing or has another accessibility need, so it's not the general accessibility of the entire group, but a specific need that's been identified by somebody, you could put that in other as opposed to AV. But it needs to be specific in that instance. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, so Kat had a question about trainers and or facilitators. They have always filled out the section, they've always put the section out with the name of staff who are training or facilitating, but have always put 0 since it's in their job description. And they are not contracting with them to do the work. Do they need to put their rate of pay for the time in the form?
Yes, you really should put the rate of pay for the time in the form. I think, there are a lot of things that we had not identified originally that you needed to do specifically. There are some vague areas in the form, and sometimes it's helpful and sometimes not so helpful. So this is one of them that, if you remember originally, Kat, the form, we didn't even identify staff who would be trainers and facilitators. In fact, the form said external trainers and facilitators. Then when they came out with a new form, they had dropped the word external. And so at first, we kind of went along with the way we had always been doing it, but then as we talked to other components, we realized that that was an intentional drop and that we needed to add the cost of internal trainers and facilitators. Because remember, the point of this whole process is for the department to have a clear understanding of how much it is spending on conferences, trainings, meetings, everything that falls under the conference definition. And so that is part of the cost, even though they're full-time paid staff, yes. In that instance, you should kind of want to pretend that they're consultants and how much of their time is being devoted to this. So sorry that that's the answer.
So how can we plan ahead for interpreters to make sure that we have adequate interpreters for these conferences?
Well, part of it, too, goes back to the 90 days before you need to know submission, right? That one of the big things, this has been one of our big issues, is many people, many events are being submitted just 90 days before the first day of the event, when in reality, for OVW's purposes, it needs to be at a minimum 90 days before you need to know. So that's before you want to sign your contract, before 90 days before the hotel needs to know. You can even do more. We've seen many more people coming in now, 6 months in advance, a year in advance. To us, that gives you sufficient time for a full registration process. Remember, many of our grantees have to go through their own approval process to get permission to use grant funds. And some of them, their process is more arduous than the federal process to get travel approved. So if you don't have enough time before the first, you're able to start registration, that doesn't provide them enough time, and that can be impacting your ability to get enough participants signed up. And it is through that registration process that you'll find out about the accessibility needs of your attendees, hopefully. Hopefully you'll all do the VERA training if you haven't done it yet. More questions?
So this is a follow-up on the facilitator and staff costs. And Tanya wants to know if staff trainers need to be, do they need to be on top of the form? So section.
So you're saying yes, but sheet B, yes, yes. They should be on sheet B as well.
Because you're also listing out you would list them on the top because there's a section where you're going to list out what their expertise is and why they've been chosen as a facilitator or trainer. So that gives you the ability to just add in a little bit more information on them. So they would be listed on top as well.
Okay. Did you have something else to add? Okay. We have one more question about the facilitators and staff. Is there a way to identify the internal cost?
So, well, the internal cost would be their rate of pay, and you assume that if they're going to be there for, what's their rate of pay, their hourly pay, right? And how many hours are they presenting? So that's what I would put on the form. You could put their daily rate if they're going to be there 3 days, but I'm actually, in this instance, I'm going to give you a wishy-washy answer and say that you could go either way. The number of hours they're presenting or facilitating, or if it's going to be on and off, and I would just use the number of days that they're going to be there. It is a cost. So one way to think about why you also need to do this is what we're also trying to get at is those costs that, but for this event, we would not incur those costs. Now, Kat, to your point, though, if you think about it, if somebody's on staff full time, we would still incur the costs even if we didn't have the event. So I might talk to JMD about that. Let me get back to you. I'm going to double check.
So this is actually another follow-up, and maybe you can expand more on So our trainers, our staff now added to the trainers and presenter section.
If staff are going to be presenting, then they should be there. It should state that Aisha Gaston, whatever her organization is a presenter. It also helps us to see, so for instance, I'll use this example. We had a recent event where literally there were 18 faculty, okay? Then if you added in the staff who were also there, we were at 24. So that paints a different picture in terms of we've got this many people from the outside training and this many staff people training. We're trying to paint the appropriate picture of what is going on and what is actually really needed. And, I think OVWTA providers do an excellent job. I honestly believe, I've said this before and I'll say it again, that it would be more dangerous for us to be putting grant dollars on the street with no training and technical assistance than actually to not be putting grant dollars on the street, because TA is that important to ensuring that people are doing their jobs properly, with the efficacy that we understand around these issues. However, that being said, the department had a real challenge in terms of just what are we spending on conferences and meetings. And we have run into a few where we've had to say, we don't really need this. Or, are we really going to have a conference where the ratio of staff to trainers or trainers to participant is like 2 to 1? And there are certain events that the ratio is appropriate to have such a small ratio. Okay, so I think
so since staff will still be getting paid no matter what, it seems like that is not really an additional cost of the conference, since they will be paying for those staff no matter what. So I think
and actually, that was when I said I would go back to JMD. JMD is the Justice Management Division, because as I processed that too, it did occur to me that you're right. However, that being said, JMD still may want that cost, and they may want it from the perspective of, so for this event, you're going inside, but what if for the next version of this event, you used an outside trainer instead of somebody on staff? So while they would be getting paid anyway, the argument could be, but it's still a cost to the event. But I'm happy to follow up with them to see what they say.
So staff trainers, should they be listed on sheet B at the bottom? Yes.
Yep. So you're going to end up listing them twice, because they're going to appear at the top with your faculty and facilitators. And then, it doesn't have to be long at the bottom in terms of, you're still saying to us the number of staff you are traveling to this event, period.
So, Kat, to answer your question, unfortunately you cannot be unmuted, but if you email us questions, then we can add it to the presentation that's going to be on the TA to TA website if you have any additional questions.
Unless there's something we're missing, Brianne or Patricia, if you want to chime in, I don't think we can unmute people, or can we?
We can unmute people if they've called in by the phone and we know their phone number. Who do you want to unmute?
Kat is requesting to be unmuted. Kat, can you email Brianne your number?
We got it. She's unmuted, right?
Got it. So she's unmuting.
Yeah, all right, there. Thank
Wow.
you. I super appreciate it. I feel like I could type all this out, but it's so much easier to just sort of clarify my question about interpreters, which was a little bit different.
Okay.
So we regularly ask people about accessibility when we do registration. We never open registration until the CRF has already been approved.
Yeah.
Here's my question then. We often, my understanding from the webinar was that we needed to have interpreters in Section J, the attendee station. We often don't know whether we're actually going to need the interpreters that we are putting in the CRF or not. We always put them in case we need them.
And I would agree with that.
Right. We always put them in case we need them, both for Spanish language access and also for ASL. But here's the thing is we often will work with the participant who tells us that they need an interpreter for them to potentially bring their own interpreter with them, or for them to identify that they would like us to contract with an interpreter in whatever town or locale that we're at for the meeting. But we never know until until the registration is complete and we've had that conversation with the attendee about what they prefer. So I wondered about your thoughts in terms of, if we don't know for sure, first of all, that we will even need interpreters, and second of all, we certainly don't know what their attendee station will be because we don't know who they are. How do we then handle that? We've put the costs in, but we just don't know, what all of the sort of logistics of that will be until we talk with somebody. And sometimes the locale that we're in, they don't have the interpreters that we need, or they don't have that. They would prefer to bring someone with them to be able to do the interpretation, in which case, whenever possible, we want to work with them within the sort of range that feels best to them.
And I think what you guys are doing is the gold standard, and the best practice that we would like is assume you're going to need interpreters. It should be part of the assumed budget plan projection for your event. And particularly, I will say this too, if you are inviting grantees, which you should be, from Puerto Rico, and if you're really expecting them to be there, I would definitely assume the Spanish language interpretation is going to be needed. So the grantees, it's open to everybody. It's basically what we want people to feel, that I can go to an OVW event and they will have planned for this. So yes, you're going to have to, in terms of duty station, you can, to me, I might guess the most expensive possible duty station, but it's also, I would use them as a nationwide as to categorize their duty stations. But that way you could get somebody from anywhere, which you could anyway, but I wouldn't feel that you need to lock them into a particular duty station location for the purposes of the form.
The core of that is that we've never counted them as attendees, and that's really what the duty station does, is it adds them into that attendee number. We've never counted interpreters or, in terms of any of our accessibility specific needs, we've never counted that within our attendees because we don't know realistically at all whether we will need them or not, and whether we'll need one or two or multiple. If we had somebody who needed both Spanish language and someone who needed ASL, we could potentially end up with 4 to 5 interpreters, because they often need, backup to switch off and on. So my concern is that bumps up the attendee numbers, and then if we don't actually need them, then that skews our ratios.
So I'm actually going to say that, again, you guys are following the gold standard, because I would not, I'm glad you put it that way, because as you were talking, I was processing the same thing. You brought up another challenge for us. Then I would not count them in your duty station count. I would keep them strictly in your costs, in your budget. You are right, because the thing we're running into is a lot of people saying they're going to have 30 participants or 50, and then people are not making that. And since those figures are used to calculate your caps of the categories that have budget caps, and people usually seem to be budgeting right to the cap, then there's no wiggle room. So I agree with you. Thank you very much, Kat. I would not include them in the duty station list, but I would include them as a budgetary cost, if that makes sense. On your other section is where I would put the interpreters.
Yep, that's exactly what we've been doing. So I just wanted to make sure we didn't need to do something differently.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I'm telling everybody to contact you. You're on my short list of people to contact. You guys have very clean forms that are very thorough, easy to follow, and, so you get pretty fast reviews usually.
Thank you.
Back for them to include in the last year, so this is just going to be a change.
Okay. Yeah, no, I would not put it in account, because, that's where people will be losing people. Yeah. If you don't need them in the end, right.
So the next question is, for the staff who are attending these conferences but not attending as presenters or trainers, how Are those costs reflected on the request and report?
Well, right now there's not a category for staff who are not presenters or facilitators. They are only in Section B when you're describing the staff sheet B, the staff you're bringing. And it's for our edification as to their presence in Section B or on Sheet B in terms of knowing how many people are going to be in the room. And I know that a lot of people interpreted that as a need to cut back on the number of staff, and that really was not the purpose. You should have enough staff to do your mic running if that's what they're needed for, to do staff the meeting in general, but we want to be careful that the grant is not being charged their travel expenses, the travel expenses for somebody who is not in some way participating in carrying out this event. So whether it's that they are manning the registration desk, mic running, facilitating, what have you, there should be a purpose for every staff member the cooperative agreement is paying for their attendance. If somebody's coming for professional development in your organization and that was not assumed in the cooperative agreement, and by that it wasn't part of your cooperative agreement budget, then the cooperative agreement cannot pay for them to be there. Now some of you may, it might be your indirect cost, that's fine, but it can't be that we're going to pay their travel and they're just there for their own staff development, professional development. So I hope that helps.
Okay. So this question is another Sunita question. The trainers, are they going to be listed, the staff trainers, are they going to be listed twice on the conference form in the Section B and where else?
At the top of Sheet B and the bottom.
On the top, it's the facilitating what the role is, and on the bottom, what foster agreement staff.
Okay. So it'll be, you'll add them to the top and at the bottom of Sheet B.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes people just put all their staff in one little box on Sheet B. That's fine.
And I think that Kat's question about interpreters was answered.
Okay. So thanks for asking that, Kat. That was most helpful for me to work through. Anybody else?
So another question. Okay, so this is a question about agendas. Occasionally, they do make minor adjustments to the agenda. Do the agendas need to be resubmitted for approval?
Well, there are two ways of thinking about it. This is what I would say. Keep in mind that your agenda needs to be approved, the final agenda anyway, by your OVW program specialist. Your OVW program specialist should have been working with you on this event. It should not be a surprise to them when they get the conference form that the event is happening. So if you are really working together in collaboration on the event, your OVW program specialist can really help guide you as to when an agenda has changed so much that the conference form itself needs to be reapproved. So I will use an example that occurred a couple years ago where we did not find out that not only had the agenda changed, the title had changed of the event, the basic purpose of the whole event had changed. And we only found out in the reporting process later when that particular event got pulled by the Inspector General when they were pulling events, and we couldn't find it on our list of approved events because we had nothing by that title. And then we looked at what we had approved. It was a completely different agenda. So that totally did away with the purpose of conference requests, that this conference process is, part of it is to say that DOJ, it is our responsibility to ensure that the events that are being held are within the statutory scope of our programs. And we are the only ones who can say that. Now, if there's an appropriate partnership with the program specialist, then hopefully that's, happening. But we know that sometimes some of the partnerships have fallen down for a variety of reasons, some of them OVW reasons. So this process ensures that the department is approving conferences, meetings as in the scope of our funding, and that it's, towards our mission. Now, a minor change, I'm going to give you what a minor change might be. It might be that you've adjusted the times. You thought a session was going to be 2 hours and it's only going to be an hour and a half. That's a minor change. A minor change, and it does not need to come back through the conference process. A minor change would also, maybe that you thought you were going to have Sunita present, but instead you're going to have Aisha. We're going to trust that you're working in concert with your program specialist, and that this person, we're going to trust you all that this other person has the qualifications. Now, if the new person, the new trainer, is going to cost more, you still need to make sure you have gone through the necessary GAN process with your program specialist if their rate needs to be approved by OVW. The approval of a higher consultant rate is separate and apart from the conference process. But that's not something where I would say you need to give us a form to look at again. A change that would be substantial is the purpose of the meeting has changed, the substantive purpose. You're going to be covering an entirely different topic or substantially different. Another change that needs to come up is the dates have changed. That can be done very fast. It only takes us a few days on a date change. But we have had some interesting instances where people are holding events where we know it's going to affect your participant registration. A third one would be if you were changing the city. You would need to come up to us. I would say this, a change from a from the Hilton to the Marriott, no. A change from the Hilton to Four Seasons, don't even think about making that change anyway. But if you did it, you definitely need to bring it up. So a change to a luxury property absolutely should come up for approval. A change to a similarly situated venue, no, unless you're changing the city. So I hope that helps in terms of minor changes. We're not, again, you want to move something that's going to happen in the morning to the afternoon? No, that's fine.
Okay, so this is actually, to me, a two-part question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any guidance on the ratio of staff versus participants?
It's a little tricky. It really depends on a couple things. One would be, what is the style of the meeting? So, and the intended size. So let's look at a round table. You would want to be careful that you don't overwhelm your participants in a round table with too many staff. That might also make the participants feel like they're really in a fishbowl if they're equal numbers of staff to participants. But again, it depends on the purpose of the meeting. A really small meeting, there might be equal number of participants to staff. A meeting of less than 5 people, I could easily see having an equal number. A meeting of 20, you maybe would not. I think it's also going to be dependent, again, on the style of the meeting. The more interactive the meeting is, obviously, the more staff you're going to need for participants. But the more lecture style the meeting, presentation style, you're going to need fewer staff there. And I would also think about what is the purpose of your staff in the room. You don't want 10 staff just sitting at the back of a table, even for a 60-person meeting. There should be some purpose of staff being there.
So the second part to that question is, would it be ideal to have the facilitators and trainers and maybe the project coordinator and have an additional staff come to run mics?
It depends, again, on your meeting size. I would honestly say, so I attended a meeting not too long ago that I want to guess was about 50 people, maybe 40. 40 might be more accurate. And the meeting had, at the start, only one mic runner. That was not sufficient. You also look at the size of your room when you're considering mic runners for this reason, that it can really slow down the conversation if you have only one person going front to back. And mic running is actually an art. And there's some people I could direct you to. Brianne Smith is on this phone. Brianne is one of, I would say, the expert mic runners I know out there. I know some others, where really and truly your facilitator is watching the room. And they should be able to work in consort with the mic runners, because the facilitator can also only see so much. A mic runner is also able to see, you haven't gone this way. On the other hand, I would also say I've seen mic runners take over where they're not getting that they're continually going to the same person, and the facilitator is seeing that. But I would say if you're going to have a mic runner, it's highly unlikely that one will suffice. If you needed a mic runner in the first place, you probably need at least two to make sure that the conversation can flow easily and that you're getting coverage, and that your mic runners also can get a break. Depending on how interactive the meeting is, mic runners can really be running a lot. So anyway, those are my 2 cents on mic running.
Okay, so to have multiple staff, if they specialize in a particular area of learning, I'm going to have to read this differently than it was. Is it okay to have multiple staff if they specialize in a particular area of learning, and if the format is interactive and not just lecture?
It's always okay to have multiple staff. Again, I would take you back to what is the purpose of each person being there. So when you look at the agenda, it's easily possible that I will use the example of an OVW new grantee orientation where we're going to cover GMS access, and so we're probably going to have Kyle Lorkey there from GFMD. We're also going to be covering the financial guide. We're probably going to have 2 people from our GFMD team to cover financial issues in addition to Kyle Lork, because it's going to take that expertise, and they're going to cover different areas of the guide. Somebody may be covering budget clearances, but even though they're all on GFMD, Kyle is the expert on GMS. And we're not going to ask the other 2 people to cover GMS. Or let's say we're also covering conferences. We're going to send Sunita or Aisha or myself to go cover that piece. So absolutely, what you don't want to be doing is building your agenda around the ability to take all the staff you want. It should be about your agenda and your participants, and then identify that you need this person for this particular expertise. If you need multiple people for the same area of expertise, that's the piece that you need to explain on sheet B. Why for the same topic area? And it may be there are sessions, there are subject matter areas, curricula is what I was looking for, that actually do anticipate multiple trainers, where you have 2 or 3 people training in the same session. That's fine, group training.
I think you just need to make sure the roles are defined so that can help you plan for the conference and how many people that are going to be included on the course.
Yeah. And this goes to, again, I think what sometimes we have happening is, and this may be driven by the grant process where everybody's focused on, I got my grant, I need to do all these activities by the end date. Remember that OVW quite frequently extends grants. That is the very common practice. We know that budgets aren't cleared as timely as we all would love for them to be. So with that said, what we're not seeing happening is we're not seeing people take the time to develop their curricula, to know these are the topics we're going to be covering, and I need a training on X, Y, and Z and I'm going to plan out the agenda. If there's a company curriculum, I'm going to develop that so that you can effectively identify the trainers you need. What is their area of expertise you need? And doing all that before a conference form gets submitted. I think a lot of things are still happening too often in tandem with I want to get the form approved before I have finalized my curriculum. So, any other questions? We had, prior to the call, somebody asking about the grant number disclaimer. You know, that lovely disclaimer that you're supposed to put on materials. And we do recommend that you include the grant number and disclaimer on your agenda. It doesn't have to be on every single page. It can be on the last page of the agenda at the bottom, but that's a best practice. We won't send your form back for not having it, but well, we'll have a conversation here. Let's see. We had another internal OVW question. About travel day costs. And a lot of, if you're hiring outside consultants, you're often paying them for both the day that they're training, and then you also are probably paying them for travel days. We do allow payment for travel days. To the extent that you can, we encourage you to pay a lesser rate for a travel day, but sometimes you may not be able to do that. They may be a strong negotiator and they want the same rate they get regularly, and we understand they are out of pocket and can't do another job. We do ask that you look at their TDY to your event location in determining whether the travel to your event and from your event is worthy of a full day reimbursement, or is it half day each way? So those are the two we really work with. We don't get down to the hours. Either it's a full day or a half day, or it could be like 2 days there and back and 2 half days, I hope that makes sense. Kat, you had another question? Absolutely. Jump on the line if you still can get on.
Can we get Kat back on the line? Or unmute it?
So I hope that that's clear, that you can pay consultants travel days.
There we go.
Okay.
Hi. Okay, so here is the question one of our staff actually had, and I wasn't sure about even completely how to ask it, because in the, we made everybody watch the first webinar, and then we came up with questions together, right?
Thank you.
So
okay.
One of the things that we did have a follow-up question on, but we weren't even sure how relevant it was, it says on the PowerPoint that trainers should get paid for all work, even if in excess of 8 hours a day, right? So here is our question about that. We typically, it's a very different thing to say $450 a day, for example, than it is to say $56.25 a day and then have a 12-hour day. And so,
no, maybe that's not clear then.
Okay.
Kat.
Okay.
Yeah. No. So it is supposed to be an 8-hour day.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So we often will have folks, because sometimes our meetings are, or trainings are ones in which, we're facilitating, but then perhaps in the evening we recognize, gosh, these 3 major things got brought up, and we need to think about how to integrate those into the next day of training. And we might want to be working together, for example, with our trainer on how do we tweak how we're talking about this to make sure that we get those things addressed, or do we need to move things around? So we find that often our trainers are putting in more than 8 hours a day. But typically, we've just straight up negotiated a daily rate that they don't apply to necessarily to an 8-hour day, but to just that day.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
That
so
totally makes sense.
we were concerned that there was an expectation that, or the other thing that we were thinking about is like we may contract with somebody for $450 or $650 or something in between there, right? For the training, and then perhaps they travel home that night as well. Again, we don't pay them more than 8 hours, more than the full day range, even if they work more than 8 hours, because we've contracted with that expectation. And we wanted to make sure we weren't doing something wrong.
No, you're not. I'll
Okay.
tell you what. In the webinar, we were actually trying to get to the reverse situation going on, which is situations in which it's less than a full day, the rate that's being negotiated, if that makes sense, that people are negotiating 6 hours.
Got you. Okay.
So when you negotiate the rate, it should be assumed that it's an 8-hour day or it's a contracted term, right? You're going to do whatever needs to be done for this event.
Right, right.
You know, and we're going to pay you for this event for 4 days, and here's your daily rate. But to your point, that doesn't mean that you're not going to do the evening, you know, debrief and all that. It was really trying to get at, trying to think of a more accurate way to describe this, the situation in which it's really, the rate is really a 6-hour day rate.
Got you. Okay, that's not what our concern was at all, so I think we're good.
Okay, good. So we had another one here, another question, which this is an internal OVW question someone had asked. And I'm having trouble reading here. Oh, the logistical and programmatic costs and interpreting these costs. And this is one of those areas where my first suggestion, recommendation to everybody is this. Be consistent with yourself, because there really is not a lot in the DOJ guidance on what is the difference between logistical and programmatic. In fact, there's nothing at all. So you have to go with your gut instinct. We have, and it can get really into some finite distinction between agencies, so long as you are consistent with every form you submit in terms of deciding what activities for your organization are going to be deemed logistical versus programmatic, because it is a fine line between the two. There are some that you might consider obvious, and I think that I added some confusion in the previous webinar when I said that registration would be a logistical cost. Registration is not always logistical. I can easily see instances in which registration is actually programmatic, particularly for smaller events where it's an invitation only and registration involves identifying possible participants. In those instances, it could easily be a programmatic cost. Again, be consistent with yourself, and if your organization should be consistent with itself on all of its forms. If you're determining that registration is going to be programmatic, or registration when it involves these staff doing X activities will be programmatic, but maybe other staff over here who are manning the registration desk, that might be logistical. But unfortunately, it's not as clear the distinction between what is logistical and what is programmatic. And actually, I think that our guidance from the department is there are probably more things that should go into programmatic that are being put in logistical. So I would lean more to programmatic. You may be thinking it's logistical, and it really is a programmatic cost. For instance, I hope, agenda development to me is clearly programmatic. Curriculum development, clearly programmatic. Developing the faculty, working with the faculty, that is programmatic. Searching for your hotel venue, I think it's largely logistical, but someone could probably convince me that there's some little measure of it that might be programmatic in terms of your event has to match the needs of your program. And that's one of the reasons that we allow you to do your conferences in-house and don't require you to work with a big, meeting planning firm, because often those people are not close enough to the curriculum, to the agenda, to the program to effectively incorporate the program's vision into selecting the right venue. But this is just one of those tricky areas that you're going to have to, decide on your own where the line is. There might be some more obvious things that really, if your gut's telling you that it belongs here, then go with that. So I hope that's helpful. Those might have been all of the internal questions we had. I do see one other. Why is an in-person meeting required box? Yeah, sometimes people have become a little lax in, this is on sheet A, where we're asking you why an in-person meeting is required and to justify it. And I think where we can get a little lax is that, yes, we approved the event in its most basic form when we approved your cooperative agreement. But this is the most basic form. This is just a general idea, and it really doesn't get to the actual costs related to this. And so once you start putting those two together, there are many instances in which you could see somebody saying, well, do you really need to do this in person? Or could it easily be as effective over the phone or in a webinar-style format? So even though it was approved in the cooperative agreement, it's the general idea that was approved. Many times we're approving 4 conferences over the course. So we would appreciate if you did not use as your justification that it was it's a deliverable of your grant. That is not a sufficient justification because the deliverables can be modified. So, keep that in mind that the department could come back and say, well, then change that deliverable or drop that deliverable and give us back the money. So that is not a sufficient deliverable. There should be a reason why an in-person event, and it doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out explanation. It can be a sentence or two, but why is this event necessary? And we've had some good ones from people who, explain. Like it doesn't have to be a repeat of your whole application. So you don't need to go that far, but some indication that you think it's necessary.
So we have a little more than 5 minutes. Oh, okay. So, Kat said this has been super helpful.
Well, thank you, Kat. You've been super helpful also. So great having you on the call. Great having everybody here. I hope that we've answered some questions, even if you haven't, everybody hasn't asked. Maybe the questions that others have asked have been helpful to you, and maybe when we get off this call, you might think of some others. Feel free to email us. You can email Sunita, Aisha, myself, and our emails at DOJ are really easy these days. It's our first name for most of us, firstname.lastname@usdoj.gov. You can also, I'm sure, get in contact with NCJFCJ through TA to TA, and they'd be happy to get in touch with us if you don't want us to know you're asking the particular question. I know sometimes people want to be anonymous. And, hopefully someday maybe we'll see a cessation in conference costs, but for now, it's alive and well. And so we appreciate your continued support and continued attention to, this annoying but important detail in our work, right? It may be, because I will say this as we close. Doing this process, while it has been challenging, we have actually learned a lot about our events and things that we didn't know. Most of it, I'd say 90% has been very positive, but there's maybe been about 10% where we said, oh, we really do need to tighten up on this or make some changes. So it has been eye-opening in some areas not the least of which is the need for accessibility and the fact that we need to be encouraging accessibility and raising it with the department constantly, that this is very important to OVW, important to our TA providers and our grantees, that events are accessible to everyone. So thank you all for your attention to that as well. And just thank you for the work that you do. You know, you do important work. If nobody said that to you today except for OVW, let us be the ones to say it. We really appreciate everything you're doing for survivors and the fact that we can help you do that. So thanks, NCJFCJ. We're going to end here then.